Well, thank you, and welcome to Shades Injustice podcast. We have our very special guest on today, Dr. Mary Clifford. Do you mind waving at us, Dr. Clifford? And then we also have the one and only Alison Feigh. So glad to have both of you with us on today. And we have entered into this new series of breaking layers of injustice for women. So you all are a part of that new series, and we'll be talking about the book that you all put together and have done great work with that. We can't wait to hardly get to those questions. But first off, I just want to welcome you and thank you for being with us. And let's start with Dr. Clifford. What started you on the path of your book? It's a very unique book, which has to do with sex crimes and offenders. So what started you on that whole path?
Thank you, Dr. Hill. And I'm so grateful to be here. It's such an important topic, and I don't know how else to say it takes people like you who are willing to cover it and have conversations, because it's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing kind of preparatory thing. And I think that kind of describes at least a little bit my own personal interest. You know, of course, like everyone I know, people who I care about have been impacted by sexual violence and sexual harms. And so my role as a criminal justice professor at St. Cloud State invited just critical reflection about this topic that kept coming up in a variety of different ways. And so when I started thinking about sex crimes and sexual violence, I did the thing which we always do as professors. You put together a class, you teach a class, and then you have students who invite you to think about what the heck you're doing and how you decided what you're doing. And Allison was one of those brilliant students who came up and said a lot about gender violence and the prevention of gender violence and her interest in it, her work in it. And so the collaboration kind of started from there. But I will also tell you that one of the other things that has informed the structure of this particular book is my own work in anti-racism education. When we started talking about race, and when we started thinking about how race and gender kind of combine to create really oppressive structures and power dynamics, not only around patriarchy, but also around this racialized construction of the United States historically, but even how we cover and respond to sexual violence and sexual harm. So when you pull those pieces apart, it was like, one of the things I do is try to figure out how you cover a conversation and a topic more broadly in an academic arena in a way that includes this often overlooked element, the racialized piece and the gender violence kind of harm piece. How do you get the voice of women to present the victimization of women in a way that sometimes a male voice misses, right? And so same thing with a racialized harm. There was not a lot of information about the way that sexual violence was perpetrated against communities of color, particularly slave communities, and how all of that was completely omitted in some of the textbooks that I had looked at in developing this course. And so when we started digging into some of the textbooks that were out there, we were just like, we can do better. So we decided to do that, right?
Absolutely awesome. You said a mouthful, so many different things, but we'll get further into some of that, the history in a few minutes. But before we get to that, I'd like to speak to Miss Allison and have her share how your journey began with this book on sex crimes and the offenders.
I also want to echo Dr. Clifford and thank you for having me here. I've been a sexual assault advocate since 1997. So I've worked with families of missing people predominantly. I work for the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. So it's families of people experiencing abuse. And every time you meet a new family, the question is, how could we have gotten ahead of this? What could we have done differently? So then my passion for prevention is reignited every time I meet a new family and think of where's our prevention piece? So I had been in the field for years and decided to step away for a bit and get my master's. And I met Dr. Clifford in the classroom, and I I come from the lens of how can we get everyone around the table and how can we prevent and how can we get all the voices here? And I was frustrated, not with her, but with the text, feeling like they're really celebrating the criminal, like celebrating the, do you know the name of the serial killer? Do you know the name of the, and we're losing the victim piece in a lot of it. I have a lot of issues as well with a lot of like the podcasts about crime, that they really seem to celebrate the crime versus honoring those who've lived through this or whose families have been impacted. So I grew up as a kid having a friend going missing, and then that was sort of the impetus to learn about missing children. And then client after client after client, it's how can we get ahead of this? So talking to Dr. Clifford about how can we do a better job of talking about crimes that happen that people are really interested in and people are very passionate about, in a way that focuses on prevention and makes room for everyone around the table.
Thank you, Allison. You bring up a very good point. We hear, and it's sad, instead of helping and celebrating the survival of the crime, we put too much emphasis as a society around the offenders. So thanks for bringing that out. Hey, I'm going to ask both of you ladies to respond to this question. What is the history around sexual assault? Okay. What do you see is the history? And I mean, that right there is a whole podcast. So, but I'm interested to hear from your viewpoint as you share on that question.
So Allison, do you want me to go first? Is that okay?
As the more historian, please go first.
So the thing that's so powerful and a little bit intimidating is I have already forgotten as much as I have learned about sexual violence and sexual violence prevention. And the thing is, there's just so much of it, is what I'm saying. Story after story after story is a person after person after person. And then some of these collective crimes get lumped together, right? Like the missing and murdered Indigenous women or Indigenous relatives, right? The idea that there's a collection of people have had certain kinds of offenses that have not been acknowledged or not been really visited in a way that warrant attention and care. I cannot tell you how many I saw in doing the research for this book, but the thing that stood out, I think more than anything, is what we titled the first chapter, which is, let me get it right, listening to the silence surrounding sexual health and harms. And so when you think about how many people have been assaulted and don't talk about it, when you think about how many people have relatives, children, family members that they love and know and care about who are traumatized by sexual violence and sexual assault, sometimes people get married, they have long, intimate relationships with people, and they never know that they have been a victim of sexual assault. And so I think for me, the thing that stands out, one of the things that stands out the most, and there are so many, depending on the day, depending on the story, depending on the location, depending upon the historical, components, I think there are so many things that stand out. But one is that people would rather be silent. People would rather relocate their family. Historically, people would rather not talk about rape. They would rather do anything than talk about rape. They would rather see it as something else in their own mind than actually call it what it is. And so I think some of the silent pieces of the story around sexual assault, and then with that, of course, go the fact that we won't have enough or as much response if we don't have an open, real conversation about the degree of harm, the level of harm, the types of harm that warrant, right, the response culturally and socially. That's within families, that's within communities, that's within healthcare services, that's within, as Allison has already mentioned, being an advocate for prevention is another whole level of support that we didn't even realize required another level of support. So if you respond to really traumatic incidents over and over again, it becomes part of your own trauma. And so how do we help the people who are helping? And so those are things that started coming out as we started doing collectively as a community more intentional work and more intentional storytelling and more intentional advocacy.
And it's
I
tricky
appreciate.
to know numbers in the sense that people tend not to come forward unless they see a trajectory of respect, they see a
Yes,
trajectory of being
yes.
valued, they see a trajectory of justice. And
Mhm.
sometimes there are pockets where someone says, okay, I feel like I can come forward in this community with this person in this system. But it's hard to have accurate numbers for anything when we know we do not have a society yet that's created safe spaces for all. And I mean, and
Mhm.
I don't think there's anyone who would debate that. I'm like, yep, we've got this figured out. Like, we absolutely haven't. We're trying, we're working on it. I work for Zero Abuse Project, and they work on the Trauma Informed Prosecutor Project. They work on, Child First with training forensic interviews, all these different components to make it easier for kids and for sexual assault victims. But you have to have history, you need sort of the numbers. And even just looking at the missing child movement, it wasn't until the 1980s we started keeping records of missing people outside of just jurisdiction. So we can look from the 1980s to present, and they've done what are called NISMART studies about every 10 years to get a sense. But we know people went missing before the 1980s. We know that sexual violence happened before the 1980s. And so I think we will know more about what the scope looks like of the problem when we create a world where everyone can feel safe in telling their story. And we are not there yet.
I remember a few years ago, my father passed in 2012, and right before he passed, maybe 2010, 29, somewhere in there was a show called 48 Hours.
Mhm.
And it was about women that had been found dead within a mile of my dad's home.
Mm.
Just at least 8 to 10 women. Never knew their names,
Mhm.
never heard from their families, never saw anything else on TV around it, not even with the news. You know how, they'll say there was a woman found. I don't even remember hearing anything. So the history behind Indigenous women being sexually assaulted and then even killed or murdered, the numbers are out there, but nobody talks about it. So I appreciate two things you women have already said. Number one, prevention. And then number two, Dr. Clifford mentioned that it just continues. It's without numbers, it just goes on and on and on. And we got to get to the point as a society where we can talk about it. We can have that conversation. We can be real, because with numbers like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 individuals have been sexually assaulted in America, especially women. So if we had two more women on this show tonight, at least one of them could have been sexually assaulted.
And
So
a lot of the
something
stats
to
now are
think
saying
about.
1 in 3 women have been assaulted, 1 in 6 men, and then we know our GLBTQIA plus folks the Department of Health says are victimized at a same rate or higher than women. So we're looking at 1 in 3, and I know that I've been in environments, and I'm sure you all have as well, where one person feels safe telling the story, and it's that Me Too of other people
Yes,
nodding and other people affirming, and
yes,
people carry with them their experiences, and it's not until they're in a place where they feel like it's safe to speak that we're going to even know that to count them in those numbers, and that they want to be counted, because there's a lot of different dynamics at play, and it's survivor first in the sense of it's not always safe for someone to say Me Too or even not along. And so how can we create a culture where we have a more accurate view of history, because because we've done work in the systems to fix disparities, so that people can say, yes, this has happened to my family, and I feel comfortable saying that, and I know that I will be given the respect that I deserve.
absolutely. Thank you for that. One of the next things I want to talk about is, why do you think our criminal justice system has a bias around sexual assaults, especially when it comes to women? I was totally upset when I found out there are thousands of rape kits that have never been opened or used for investigations. They're just stockpiled somewhere. After a woman goes through the act of putting together that rape kit, how degrading that whole thing must feel. And then for them to just stockpile them somewhere with never going back in and using that to identify the suspect or the offender, it's just, it's very upsetting to me. So I'd like to hear from you ladies around the criminal justice system being biased when it comes to sexual assault.
So,
Oh, you go first. I'm ready.
no,
I'm ready.
Allison, I think you should go first this
Okay,
time.
I'll go first this time. So I work for an agency, it's called Zero Abuse Project, and our goal is to help equip folks who are in the field responding primarily to child abuse. And the work that I do is child abuse, but it's all in the same realm, to make sure that if when a kid comes forward, they get an interview that is respectful and that can hold up in court with, that lets us know what happened or what didn't happen, that their exam by a doctor is someone who's had special training, who knows how to make this done in a way that's victim centered. And so putting, everything being survivor first, everything being victim first, because what I've found in this work is a lot of times they say, well, you're a new prosecutor, let's get you started with the kid cases so that until you know what you're doing, and then you can get the real ones, or, oh, you're really interested in trauma, let's have you start with this and learn. And it's sort of like the learning grounds versus people being fully equipped and being ready. And when you have someone who's fully equipped and ready, the positive ripple effect that creates in the justice system, of someone who understands the value of multidisciplinary teams, someone who understands and does the work to really know how to be effective in their role. When everyone's playing together in the sandbox in the way that isn't about territory and isn't about ego, but it's for the kid, then we see that, when someone causes harm, there's that stone in the water and that ripple effect that goes out, right? When we have the helpers, Mr. Rogers always said, when something's horrible, look for the helpers. It'll make you feel like, give you that perspective again. You see those helpers going in through the deep end and that ripple effect of positivity and how that can help. And I think it is about training. It is about resources. It is about making abuse a priority. Because it's like, well, yeah, abuse survivors are going to not be as easy to work with as property crime or as car theft, or because there's shame that we have in our culture. There's all these different dynamics of who, what were you wearing and how did you know this person? How did you let them in your house? Like all these things that we need to not speak, so I think when I think about the inequalities and the frustration and, even just the rape kits, I think the answer is better equipping folks so that when they hit the ground running, they know about adverse child experiences. They know about how to sensitively interview a victim, because every time someone has a positive effect, then we have that ripple effect of, okay, I feel like I can come forward with this person. I'm sure you've had experiences professionally. You're like, in this agency, call this person, right? In this, call this. And we need everybody to be those people that we can feel comfortable sending clients to, so that we can do a better job. And it is by no means are we in a place of saying, we've got this figured out. And I think it's also going to take voices of people who haven't been harmed, that we call them bystanders in this work, bystanders who haven't been directly harmed, to say, excuse me, this is what I'm seeing. As a third party, we get those bystander voices involved. They have a lot of sway and a lot of power. And so finding opportunities for people to use their voice and use their lived experience to make changes. I'll toss the mic to you, Dr. Clifford, after that.
Well, yeah, and so part of the reason I love, I say ongoing, working with Allison is because she's just so thoughtful. And of course, the work that she does on the ground is unparalleled. I mean, it's one thing to think about it. It's another thing to talk about it, to reorganize it, to structure it. But it's, seeing the eyes of the people, the families who are in the middle of this, that is such powerful and important work. And I think one of the things that can't go unsaid is that just like we see a racialized police structure, we also see a gender power differential that reflects our society. And people don't like talking about patriarchy. Maybe they don't like talking about feminism. Sometimes people get upset about, name calling or implicating entire disciplines or fields, entire police departments, because you say, there are some police officers who are not as capable of responding to a sexual assault situation as other police officers in the same scenario that Allison just described. The idea that you have training, the idea you have all these things, you still have people who come to situations with preconceived ideas about what women should have done or could have done. And as a result of that, you get an attitude that is not trained away, right? You get a cultural context from which these attitudes come. Having said that, that's not even enough, because you add on to it policemen, departmental attitudes and cultures, and departments. Police culture is very different in different departments. And we have documented cases where some police departments would lower grade a sexual assault so they didn't have to do the investigation, because the investigation is complicated, because it's easier to just call it a unknown assault as opposed to a sexual violence, right? And so I think, I hope we're seeing less and less of that. And I hope we're seeing more departments with a more enlightened and well-educated and well-resourced attitude about sexual violence and harms. But remember, kids are probably the least capable of expressing what happened to them. And also remember, when people are in trauma, they may or may not have a coherent presentation of the trauma they just went through. And so all of those things combine to make it really difficult to respond and to be victimized and then be accountable to someone who's coming at you hot with some questions about what happened in a particular moment of time when you can hardly, find your footing in the moment. And so I also just want to add, in some way, the criminal justice system is being reflected on Netflix movies or documentaries or other kinds of ways. And some of them are very clear presentations of harm that gives people a snippet or a snapshot into the life of someone who's gone through this kind of police interrogation that was very abusive and very presumptuous and not at all trauma informed, and in fact, replicating trauma, creating a second layer of trauma for the victim. And so I think there's just so much to say about, people are making movements in certain directions. However, there are other programs that are so badly done around sexual assault and harm. There are so many programs that are, I'm not calling any of them out, but there are just crime scene after crime scene after crime scene of women who have been victimized, almost to Allison's earlier point, where it becomes almost this overdone glorification of sexualized violence against a certain kind of pattern of television viewership. And I will say, I've gotten to the point where I can't even watch that stuff anymore. There's too many real life people who I know who have stories like that. And so I think we have to ask ourselves why we as a community have a fascination with those kinds of harms to the point where we find that as entertainment, and why we find that as something we want to spend our time just kind of, hanging out. Hey, let's go watch some sexual assault shows. And I'm not trying to be flippant. I'm seriously asking the question, because if we produce police from within a community where violence is actually happening, and those police officers reflect the communities they come from, then all of the things that Allison has mentioned before about how we need to have positive impacts and positive influences when someone has been harmed, that should become, I hope, the priority, right? In terms of how do we provide support and assistance for someone. And, I will also tell you that television is a fabulous teacher and a tutor of all kinds, right? And so in some of the old crime shows that you've seen, you can watch these gender dynamics that are just like, oh my gosh, that was just popular culture back then. Oh my gosh, that's horrible, right? I mean, so we can see both how far we've come, and we can still see, I think, how far we might go in terms of really educating ourselves and each other about the impacts of just reminding people when you post something on Facebook that is potentially triggering or potentially reminding someone of a harm that they had, you want to just be careful with people because you just don't know how many people have been affected in that way. And the criminal justice system reflects our society in a lot of ways. And so I think we're trying to do both. We're trying to raise the awareness socially and culturally, politically, create policies that reflect responsible treatment of people who have been harmed by sexual violence. But we're also trying to imagine for ourselves beyond that, right? A life where this kind of harm doesn't happen.
Well, when we look at George Floyd's murder and the white population saying, oh, I see it, so now I believe it, right? Like, oh, it's been filmed, so now I believe it. What about all the voices for generations that haven't been filmed that have been saying we have a problem, you know, in both and, you know, the both in racial injustice and in sexual crimes that happen. Like, there have been people who've been saying for a lifetime, this isn't okay. And we shouldn't need the footage to believe. You know, we should start by believing
right.
and do a better job with the voice that we have and the power that we have, and sharing that power with others.
Absolutely. Now, I have another question. I love the part in your book where you describe positive sexual acts versus harmful sexual practices. Do you all want to talk a little bit about that? We have about 3 minutes left. So if we go a little bit over, it'll be okay, but I don't want to close this part of our discussion without that being answered.
In the internet world, like I do a lot of work around internet safety, and it's, if you don't have conversations with the kids in your life and with the young people in your life about what healthy is, someone else will. You know, the
Yes.
number one thing offenders are looking for online is kids who want to talk about sex. So if we're not giving them what is healthy, what is the expectation, and someone says, oh, I sent you a picture of my penis, so now you have to send me one back. If they've never had a conversation around the what ifs, around the norms, and they're just like, oh,
Yes.
okay, I want to be fair. Oh, I don't know. So, okay, they're telling me I need to send one back. Okay. If we don't define healthy, someone else will, and we're not going to like how they define it. So to have open conversations with young people about sexuality, to talk what ifs, to ask them the questions that they have, because if we don't do it, someone else will. So most people on the internet are not trying to harm kids, but someone on a chat app at 3 p.m. asking you questions about your genitalia, not one of the healthy adults, right? So like, let's talk about, there are people out there who do use their positions of power to cause harm, and that there are people in there who are ignoring safety when it comes to kids. And if you meet one of those people, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. I want to know about it.
Absolutely.
Well, and I just want to say, Evelyn, as we kind of close out, I mean, as adults, we have conversations about what is healthy sexuality with our partners, maybe with friends. I mean, at some level, Allison and I were just, you know, having conversation about the fact that we study deviance, and there's so many gray areas between what's acceptable and not acceptable in collective kind of sexual intimacy among adults. And so if we're confused about what healthy is, then how are we expected to kind of bring that down to a level of understanding for kids? And so if we're going to talk about the crimes, we have to start with a conversation about how murky and messy and sometimes unclear healthy is. And then can we start there and then teach kids how to empower themselves to make good choices for themselves, to have healthy adults around them that they can talk to, those kinds of things. And so it seemed to me to only talk about offenders is to only exclude, you know, the kind of larger conversation about how do we get to a place where we feel confident and comfortable about our own sexual expression. And then, of course, how can we help kids move into that space as well? So
it's just like with toddlers and eating, right? We just want to make the healthy choices easy and not put a lot of pressure. And when we're talking about bodies, when we're talking about body talk, we want that to just be a part of from birth to, you know, we're here. And we're all sexual beings, and let's talk about, you know, your rights as a kid, and let you know who the people are in your life you can talk to if you meet someone who doesn't know the rules about bodies and doesn't know the rules about safety, because it isn't your fault, and you have the right to be safe.
Thank you. I remember as a little girl growing up, my dad had a conversation with myself and my 4 sisters. And by the time he got through, So it was very clear what he was saying. We all understood what he was saying, but I just thought at the time, I don't ever want to have a boyfriend.
Oh no. Yeah, we try to help parents wade through the awkward, right? We don't want kids to walk around scared. We want them to walk around smart. And so yeah, there's so much of parenting is helping our kids wade through the awkward, and you're gonna get the eye rolls, and you're gonna get the I know this already, but they really are listening, and those conversations mean the world on online and body safety.
But I appreciate my father being able to have that conversation with his 5 girls. I appreciate that. My mother at the time had passed away, so it was up to Dad. Now, by this time, I was the oldest at 13, and so all my siblings under me, but we had to have the talk.
Awesome.
But I'm glad he did it. I'm glad, because when he got through, he understood what was really going on. So I appreciate that. But just maybe
He
the
obviously left
training,
a
like you were
powerful
saying
legacy.
earlier.
He left a powerful legacy. I know 2 of the daughters in that room that day, and he knew what he was doing. So cheers
So
for him.
Yeah, I appreciate you ladies sharing that on today. And this is just part 1. We're going to have you back. This was so exciting and encouraging, and I believe we're just getting down into the meat of things. What most people don't want to talk about, we're going there. And I appreciate you all for being willing to go there. So with that being said, I want to thank you both. I'd like for both of you all to share just a little bit about the book, and then we will close out.
The book comes out in April. It's a textbook, and it can also be used as a tool in your own life to reframe conversations around sexual assault as opportunities for prevention and opportunities for advocacy.
Okay, Dr. Clifford?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is one of the reasons we framed the book in the way we did, the book, of course, is Sex Crimes and Offenders, and we're talking about questions of character and culture. And so we have this idea that there's a type of person who commits a type of crime. And so we want to ask lots of good questions around how does the culture that these individuals come from influence their social actions in any given day? How does the response by the system support, treat, assist, make harder any kind of healing that might happen? How is it that there's a relationship between someone who has been harmed and their tendency to have no outlets, right? How does the idea of someone online in a chat room talking about harming people, how does that influence, how people behave in the world? And so, I mean, there are just a lot of questions about the way that we open ourselves to those conversations, hard conversations, difficult conversations. And then there's a lot to be said about how we think forward in support of people who have been harmed. If we knew, for example, 80% of everyone has some sort of sexual violence or some sort of a sexual assault, would we have a better understanding of how to be kind and care with each other and for each other in a process that would help aid healing? So there's just a lot to say about both the questions of the individual perpetrator, but also as a culture and a community, how we come together in support of both the offender and the person who's been harmed.
Absolutely. Excellent. All right, ladies, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us with Shades in Justice podcast. Have a great evening.